The chessboard is shifting, and what happens in the next 72 hours could reshape the entire Middle East for a generation. Right now, US military assets are repositioning across the Persian Gulf, not for some abstract future threat, but because intelligence sources are painting a very specific picture. Iran may be preparing a military response that could dwarf anything we've seen in recent years. But here's what the mainstream narrative isn't telling you. This isn't happening in a vacuum. We're watching the culmination of decades of sanctions, proxy conflicts, and broken diplomatic promises finally reaching a boiling point. The Iranian leadership knows they're cornered, and cornered powers don't always make rational calculations. They make survival calculations. Meanwhile, oil markets are already pricing in disruption. Insurance rates for tankers in the Strait of Hormuz are spiking, and behind closed doors, Pentagon strategists are running scenarios that range from limited strikes to full-scale regional conflagration. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous isn't just the military buildup, it's the complete absence of diplomatic off-ramps and the fact that miscalculation on either side could trigger consequences neither Washington nor Tehran can control. The question isn't whether this matters to you, it's whether you're prepared for what comes next. Let me walk you through what's actually unfolding here, because the surface-level reporting you're getting from the cable news networks is missing about 90% of the actual story. When you see headlines screaming about Iranian threats and American military readiness, what they're really showing you is the final act of a play that's been running for over 4 decades. And like most geopolitical dramas, the script was written long before any of the current actors took the stage. First, let's establish something crucial that almost nobody in the Western media wants to acknowledge. Iran has been operating under the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history since 1979. We're not talking about targeted sanctions against specific individuals or particular industries. We're talking about a systematic attempt to strangle an entire nation's economy, to cut it off from global financial systems, to prevent it from selling its primary export, and to isolate it diplomatically from nearly every major power center on Earth. And yet, despite all of that, Iran hasn't collapsed, it hasn't fragmented, it hasn't begged for mercy or capitulated to Western demands. Instead, it's adapted, evolved, and built parallel systems that allow it to survive and even, in some sectors, to thrive. That reality alone should tell you something important about the nature of the adversary we're dealing with. Now, when American military commanders start moving carrier strike groups into position, when they're quietly reinforcing bases in Qatar and Bahrain, when they're conducting what they call readiness exercises with regional allies, they're not doing this because they've suddenly discovered some new intelligence. They're doing this because the strategy of maximum pressure has pushed Iran into a corner where its leadership is calculating that the cost of action might actually be lower than the cost of continued inaction. Think about that for a moment. The entire premise of sanctions and military pressure is supposed to be deterrence, to make the cost of aggression so high that your adversary backs down. But what happens when you've already imposed nearly every cost you can impose short of actual war? What leverage do you have left? The answer is not much, and Iranian strategists know this just as well as their American counterparts. Here's where it gets really interesting, and where you need to understand the regional dynamics that are driving this crisis. Iran isn't operating in isolation. It has spent the last 2 decades building what Western intelligence agencies call the axis of resistance, a network of state and non-state actors that stretches from Lebanon through Syria and Iraq all the way to Yemen. Hezbollah in Lebanon, with its estimated arsenal of over 100,000 rockets and missiles, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, which are now effectively part of the Iraqi state security apparatus, the Houthis in Yemen, who have demonstrated an alarming capacity to strike Saudi oil facilities and disrupt shipping in the Red Sea, Syrian government forces that owe their survival to Iranian support. This isn't a loose coalition of convenience. This is a carefully constructed strategic architecture that gives Iran the ability to project power across the entire Middle East without ever having to deploy its own conventional military forces outside its borders. And that's what makes the current situation so combustible. If Iran decides to strike, it doesn't necessarily have to launch missiles from Iranian soil. It can activate any number of proxy forces that will do the job for it, which gives Tehran plausible deniability and makes American retaliation far more complicated. How do you respond to an attack that originates from Iraq but was clearly directed by Iran? Do you strike Iranian territory directly, knowing that might be exactly the escalation Tehran wants because it would unite the Iranian population behind the government and potentially draw in other regional actors? Or do you strike the proxies, knowing that this doesn't really address the underlying problem and might just invite further escalation? These are the kinds of impossible choices that Pentagon planners are wrestling with right now, and there are no good answers. Let's talk about oil for a moment, because this is where theory meets reality for most Americans. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, handles about 21 million barrels of oil per day. That's roughly 20% of global petroleum supply flowing through a choke point that at its narrowest is only 21 miles wide. Iran has made it abundantly clear over the years that if it can't export its oil, it has both the capability and the willingness to prevent others from exporting theirs. They've conducted military exercises specifically designed to demonstrate this capability. They've developed swarm boat tactics using small, fast attack craft that could overwhelm defensive systems through sheer numbers. They've deployed anti-ship missiles along their coastline that can reach any vessel transiting the strait. And perhaps most concerning, they've shown they can deploy mines, both the old-fashioned kind and sophisticated smart mines that can distinguish between different types of vessels. Now, the US Navy would tell you they can keep the strait open, and in a purely military sense, they're probably right. American naval power is still unmatched in those waters. But here's the thing, it's not about whether the Navy can physically keep shipping lanes open, it's about whether insurance companies are willing to cover tankers transiting a war zone, whether ship owners are willing to risk vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars, whether crews are willing to sail into potential combat zones. The mere threat of closure, even without actual closure, would send oil prices skyrocketing. We've seen this dynamic play out before in smaller incidents. Back in 2019, when tankers were attacked in the Gulf of Oman, attacks widely attributed to Iran, oil prices jumped immediately, and those were minor incidents compared to what we're potentially looking at now. The economic implications ripple outward from there in ways that most people don't fully appreciate. Higher oil prices mean higher transportation costs. Higher transportation costs mean higher prices for basically everything, because everything you buy had to be transported at some point. We're already dealing with inflation that stretched household budgets to the breaking point. A major disruption in Middle Eastern oil supplies could send gasoline prices back up to levels we haven't seen since the worst days of 2022, and unlike that period, there's not much strategic petroleum reserve left to cushion the blow because we've already drawn that down significantly. The Federal Reserve would be caught in an impossible bind. Do they raise interest rates to combat inflation, knowing that would almost certainly trigger a recession? Or do they hold rates steady and watch inflation accelerate? Either choice comes with severe consequences, but let's zoom back out to the strategic level, because there's a deeper game being played here that involves players beyond just Washington and Tehran. China has been watching this entire drama with intense interest, because China is now Iran's largest trading partner and a major customer for Iranian oil. Beijing has invested billions in Iranian infrastructure and signed a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership with Tehran. That partnership isn't just about commerce. It's about China positioning itself as the alternative patron for countries that the West has isolated. Every dollar of Chinese investment in Iran, every barrel of Iranian oil that flows to Chinese refineries, every piece of Chinese technology that helps Iran evade sanctions, all of it represents a direct challenge to American primacy in the global economic system. Russia, too, has skin in this game. Moscow and Tehran have grown closer over the past decade, united partly by shared opposition to American hegemony, but also by practical strategic considerations. They've cooperated in Syria, they've coordinated on oil production to influence global prices, they've conducted joint military exercises. If the United States strikes Iran, does Russia see this as an opportunity to create problems for Washington elsewhere? Does it increase support for its own operations in Ukraine, calculating that American attention and resources are now divided? Does it provide Iran with more sophisticated air defense systems or other military technology that would raise the cost of American military operations? These aren't hypothetical questions. These are the kinds of strategic calculations that are happening in Moscow right now. And then there's Israel, which has its own very specific concerns about Iranian capabilities, particularly Iran's nuclear program and its support for groups like Hezbollah that directly threaten Israeli security. Tel Aviv has made it clear on multiple occasions that it will not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons, and it has demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to conduct strikes deep inside Iranian territory to prevent that outcome. So you've got this incredibly dangerous dynamic where Israel might launch its own preemptive strikes if it believes Iran is about to cross certain red lines, and those strikes could trigger the very regional conflict that everyone claims they want to avoid. Israeli intelligence and military planning doesn't always align perfectly with American preferences, and there have been numerous instances historically where Israeli actions have created fates accomplished that the United States then had to deal with. Now, let's talk about what Iran's actual military capabilities look like, because there's a lot of outdated thinking that treats Iran like it's still operating with 1970s-era equipment and tactics. Yes, Iran's air force is old and largely ineffective by modern standards. Yes, their navy couldn't hope to win a conventional engagement with US naval forces, but Iran hasn't been preparing to fight a conventional war. They've been preparing to fight an asymmetric war, and they've gotten very good at it. Their missile program is sophisticated and extensive, with ranges that can reach every American base in the region and every major city in Israel. They've demonstrated precision strike capabilities that were on full display when they hit Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq in 2019 with remarkable accuracy. Those weren't crude, unguided rockets. Those were sophisticated cruise missiles and drones that struck specific targets with minimal collateral damage. Iran's drone technology in particular has evolved to the point where it's now being exported and used in conflicts around the world. We've seen Iranian-designed drones in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, and most recently in Ukraine, where Russia has been using them to devastating effect. These aren't expensive, high-tech systems that cost millions of dollars apiece. These are relatively cheap, mass-producible weapons that can be launched in swarms to overwhelm defensive systems. And here's the thing about asymmetric warfare. It doesn't matter if the United States can destroy Iran's military infrastructure in a matter of days or weeks. What matters is whether Iran can inflict enough damage, enough disruption, enough economic cost to make the whole enterprise not worth it from Washington's perspective. That's the calculus that deterrence rests on. And increasingly, Iranian leadership seems to believe they've reached a point where they can impose costs high enough to change American strategic thinking. The domestic political dimension in both countries also can't be ignored. In the United States, there's virtually no appetite for another major Middle Eastern conflict. The experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan have left deep scars, both in terms of blood and treasure expended, and in terms of the domestic political consensus around interventionism. Any administration that stumbles into a war with Iran without a clear imminent threat would face massive political blowback. But at the same time, American presidents are deeply constrained by the need to appear strong, to defend American interests, to protect allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia. So you've got this tension between the political costs of action and the political costs of appearing weak or indecisive. In Iran, the political dynamics are equally complex but in different ways. The regime in Tehran has used external threats and the narrative of resistance against imperialism as key sources of legitimacy for over 4 decades. But they're also dealing with a population that's increasingly frustrated with economic stagnation, corruption, and political repression. The protests that have erupted periodically over the past few years over fuel prices, over water shortages, over women's rights reveal a society where the social contract between state and citizen is under strain. Iranian leadership has to balance the potential rally around the flag effect that a conflict might create against the risk that a military defeat or economic catastrophe could actually trigger the kind of internal upheaval that threatens the regime's survival. What's really concerning is that we're in a period where both sides might be making calculations based on flawed assumptions about the other side's intentions and red lines. This is how accidental wars happen, not because anyone necessarily wanted a war, but because each side misread the other, because signals got crossed, because an action intended as a limited demonstration of resolve got interpreted as the opening move of a larger campaign. The history of international relations is littered with examples of conflicts that spiraled out of control because decision makers on both sides convinced themselves they could manage the escalation, could keep things limited, could send clear messages that would be correctly interpreted, and there's virtually no direct communication between Washington and Tehran right now. The diplomatic channels that might allow for clarifying intentions or negotiating off-ramps barely exist. The Iran nuclear deal, which at least provided a framework for regular contact and dialogue, has been dead for years. The United States and Iran don't have formal diplomatic relations. Communication has to go through intermediaries. Oman, Switzerland, Qatar, and that kind of indirect communication is notoriously unreliable in crisis situations when you need clarity and speed. So here we are, watching military forces position themselves, watching intelligence reports filter through to policymakers, watching the machinery of potential conflict rev up while the mechanisms for preventing conflict remain weak or absent. The next few weeks are going to be critical, and I don't use that word lightly. We're at an inflection point where decisions made in Tehran and Washington could set in motion events that reshape the entire region, that send oil prices into the stratosphere, that kill thousands or tens of thousands of people, that cost hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars. And the really sobering part is that most of the people who would bear the costs of such a conflict, the service members who would fight it, the civilians who would suffer from it, the taxpayers who would fund it, have almost no say in whether it happens.